Questions for all answer. Would some honourable member care to move that the House takes note of miscellaneous business? Honourable Amy Adams.
Speaker, I so move. Mr. Speaker, what a week for David Cunliffe. What a week for the artful dodger over there, the Leader of the Opposition. Let's see where he started the week. He started the week with poll numbers that frankly made the David Shearer days look like the golden ages of Labour. And if he thought it was a bad starting point, it was all going to go from bad to worse for tricky David Cunliffe. The question on everyone's lips this week, the question that everyone's trying to get their heads around is, who is David Cunliffe? Who is he? Which of the many faces of David Cunliffe should we believe? Is it that the politics of envy Leader of the Opposition who tried to tell New Zealand that he lived a very middle-of-the-road, middle existence in his little doer-upper in the suburbs, when of course it turns out that he is one of the very wealthy in New Zealand and lives in a mansion in what can only be described as one of the most exclusive suburbs? Is it Mr. Doublespeak? Mr. Doublespeak, who promises to the unions that they can expect that they're on their way back to the good old days of the 1970s? Or is it the guy who turns up in front of the businesses and the boardrooms and promises that all will be all right under the free market Harvard graduate going back to Milton Friedman? No, I don't think it's any of those. Perhaps it's Devious Dave. Devious Dave, who came out with his child payment policy, and promised New Zealand that it would apply to nearly 60,000 families, and then had to quietly correct it to say, oh, actually, when I said 60,000, I actually meant more like 30,000, but it's all in the numbers, just a small error. Interestingly enough, he tried to blame staff for that one as well, but then he had to take responsibility for that. Perhaps it's Dodgy Dave. Perhaps it's Dodgy Dave, who New Zealand is now learning funnelled his donations through a secret trust. Now, isn't that interesting? This is the same David Cunliffe who was part of the Labour Party that reformed the electoral finance laws. They reformed the electoral finance laws in relation to donations and railed about transparency and honesty and accountability. But when it was his turn, what was the advice he took? Let's have a secret trust so we don't have to tell the public who's really backing us. Now, isn't that interesting? I mean, you've got Shane Jones was quite prepared to be open with the public. Even Grant Robertson didn't mind telling the public who was behind him. So what is it with David Cunliffe? Why is it that he couldn't be straight with New Zealand and tell them who was funding him? You have to wonder. Now he's come out and with a bit of pressure's come on, he's prepared to name 3 of the donors. But the other 2, he was quite happy to take their money, quite a substantial amount, thousands and thousands of dollars. He was happy to take it. But now that the heat's on, he'd rather just give it all back and make it go away. Well, I think New Zealand wants to know who they were. Who were they? Maybe it was Kim.com. Maybe it was his union mates. How will we know? Because this doyen of transparency and reform of electoral finance law now suddenly is Shady Dave who doesn't want to tell us anything. You have to say, since David Cunliffe became leader of the Labour Party, it has been gaffes galore. It has been one shipwreck after another. And that's only the start of them. Who remembers his electoral law breach during the by-election, when David Cunliffe broke the electoral laws in breach of the rules and said, oh, sorry, it was an error. We're hearing a lot of excuses. I think we've heard it was an error. It was a mistake of judgment. In hindsight, it was a bad call. We've heard technical glitch. We've heard oversight. We've heard that was my staff, I didn't know it was happening. And just this week he's managed to throw one of his own MPs under the bus when he let them take the rap for his own office disclosing draft policy to us. His own office disclosed the draft policy, and he was quite happy to throw one of his MPs under the bus. So we can add another one. He's also Disloyal Dave. He's Disloyal Dave as well as everything else. He came out, of course, after the grannies and congratulated Lord, couldn't spell it right, withdrew it, blamed it on an error. He couldn't get his CV right. That was a mistake, all of that padding and stuff that he'd forgotten he hadn't actually done. He copied Grant Robertson's candidacy announcement, another glitch. He misled the public on Shane Jones's stance in the leadership contest. I think the thing, Mr Speaker, is this. What New Zealand knows is that if you can't run a party, if you can't run your own affairs, you sure can't run a country. We don't want any part of Tricky Dave.
Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Green Party in government will put children at the